Welcome back to another episode of Subject Matter Expert Editorials. Today, I'd like to spend a couple minutes talking about some of the basic ways that we measure time value of money. I'd like to start off with an initial premise, a reminder that's reinforced in the course materials. Accounting profits are not the same as the present value of cash flows. And what we attempt to do in finance is find ways to measure what the economic value of cash flow is given disparate points in time. So what I'd like to introduce you to is three major ways that financial professionals measure cash flows so that they can create a basis of comparison in order to make corporate decisions or to create valuation estimates. These three methodologies, in order of preference, are net present value, internal rate of return, and the payback method. Now, first, before I go any further, it's important that when we apply each of these three methodologies, that we apply them to incremental cash flows. So when we analyze a capital expenditure opportunity or some other financial decision, we have to look at what new cash expenditures going out are, as well as the new cash inflows that are created, and that's the basis for our analysis. When we talk about net present value, we have to start off with a cost of capital. And the cost of capital is actually a subject matter that is covered in a separate video presentation. But if we know that cost of capital, that is the rate at which we discount future cash flows. So as a way of example, if we have a 7% cash flow discount rate, we end up having dollars today that are worth a certain value. If a dollar is earned a year from now, it's going to be worth 7% less than a dollar today. If we have a dollar that's 2 years out, it's going to be worth 7% to the power of 2 less. It's a compounding measurement. So if we look at net present value, what we try to do is take gross cash outflows and inflows and discount them at that rate to come up with a present value. That number can be compared to any other number based on different rates of periods, different cash flows per period. It creates a basis of an apples-to-apples comparison. Net present value is the preferred methodology because it doesn't have some of the difficulties that sometimes one can encounter using internal rate of return. So to summarize on net present value, if we end up with a positive number at the end of doing a net present value calculation, that views that project favorably. And a positive number theoretically should be a go decision. A negative number theoretically presents us with a no-go decision. So the way to use net present value is if you take a series of cash flows, discount them at your discount rate. A positive number is an affirmative decision, a negative number is not. In contrast, the second methodology with the internal rate of return is that you actually take the initial outlay and you take future cash flows and do an internal rate of return calculation, either on your financial calculator or on an Excel spreadsheet. If at the end of the calculation you end up with a rate that is higher than your cost of capital, that's a positive decision. That's a capital project or a decision that should be made. If you end up with a internal rate of return that is less than your cost of capital, that decision should potentially be not taken. The reason that net present value is preferable to internal rate of return is that there's a couple glitches with internal rate of return. They don't happen often, but they can be problematic. For instance, one major problem with internal rate of return is that if you have negative cash flows that are not consecutive, you can actually end up with two theoretical internal rates of return, which creates, obviously, problems. The second major problem with internal rate of return is that it assumes that cash flows let's say, for example, in year 2, and you're looking at a 7-year project, are reinvested at that internal rate of return for all the ensuing years up to the conclusion of the project. And that may or may not be realistic. You may be looking at a project that has a very healthy IRR, but that money may not be able to be reinvested in projects that are quite as good. So as a consequence, while IRR is very popular and it has its time value of money merits, it is potentially at a disadvantage in comparison to net present value for the aforementioned 2 reasons.
The other thing, John, about IRR that's important to understand is that IRR is equal to the discount rate where net present value would equal 0. And I'm not sure if we had a chance to mention that or not, but I think it bears repeating if so. Sometimes that helps understand a little bit better. And
that is correct. The third methodology that I want to throw in there is payback method. And I will say this as perhaps a story from a long career. I have been in many rooms where you'll see fancy IRR calculations or net present value calculations, and I see seasoned business leaders who over the years have much more experience than I do ultimately go back to a payback methodology. Now, every textbook will tell you that payback is a very poor cousin to IRR and net present value. And it is, because it doesn't take into account time value of money principles. However, I have found time and time again that very seasoned business professionals use payback not as their primary measurement, but as kind of their gut check. Because I have seen instances where you'll see these phenomenally elegant presentations where you'll get a very impressive net present value number and you'll see a very high IRR, but if those projects don't recover the invested dollars in a 7-year time frame, a lot of professionals will say, that's a great and elegant presentation, but if I can't get my money back in 7 years, I have reservations about whether we should go forward in this project because that represents a certain level of risk over a long period of time. So again, payback should never be your primary measurement of a project, but it is a very useful second measurement just to check your gut as to whether it works well.
Yeah, and a few of the things to think about when you're looking at what Higgins refers to as figures of merit is that they're all based on projections going out in the time, maybe 5 or 10 years, whatever the project may or may not last for. And I don't know about you, but I'm not even sure what I'm having for lunch today. And so it's very difficult to really make projections that are going to be, exact or very precise going that far out into the future.
And every year you go farther out, the more uncertainty there is. So, and one of the things, and this is just an add-on from practical experience, technological change oftentimes causes capital expenditures or projects to become obsolete within a certain time frame. So if you're looking too far out, all bets are off.
And the other thing that you have to take into consideration is at the end of your planning horizon, call it, the number of years that you're going to plan out, is there going to be a value to what's left of that project going forward? Is it just going to end? Even if it's going to end, and say you had purchased some equipment for that project, there might be some liquidation value or even scrap value on that equipment at that time, which you would have to factor into your net present value calculation. The other thing that you have to consider is there's a recovery of working capital at the end of the project as well. The third option is if the project's going to continue past your planning horizon, then you'd use a perpetuity model like the Gordon Growth model to determine what the value of the project is in the perpetuity and then discount that back in.
And if you're ever sitting in a meeting with a bunch of finance professionals, what Bill refers to as a value at the end of your time horizon oftentimes is referred to as a residual. So if you ever hear that term thrown around, that's what it means.
Yeah, and we're going to find as we go on, maybe not so much in capital budgeting projects, but certainly in the value of a corporation or value of an enterprise, you'll find that the terminal value, you've gone through all this elaborate calculations and projections to get the first 5 or 10 years planned out, and then you layer in the terminal value, and many times the terminal value of a project or the value of an enterprise is 70–80% of the total value that you're coming up with to end with. So there's a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of projections that you have to use. So it's important not just to have the calculations right, but to understand too that your projections are as accurate as you can get them to begin with.
So my concluding thought or comment on this part is, when you look at all the spreadsheets and we talk about NPVs and IRRs and paybacks, it sounds like a science, but I think Bill's point is a point well taken, is there's still an element of art in this and common sense judgment. So keep that in mind.